Welcome back, everyone. Thanks to all of the forum's partners who put together those virtual visits. Again, you'll have a chance to pick up any that you might have missed in the next Future Bazaar session. And again, you can follow all of the action on Twitter at Millennium Prize, where the whole business is being live tweeted. Please do share your own thoughts and use the hashtag MIF2021. Now, onward to session 2, Don't Miss the Future. It's about the idea of foresight, how to look into a crystal ball on these transformative technologies and why to do so. As before, there will be time for questions, so please do use the chat function up there to keep putting questions into the chat. And to take us through the session, I'd like to introduce the chair, Jyrki Katainen, the president of Sitra, Finland. Jyrki, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world are you watching this session. And the title of this session is Don't Miss the Future. We have distinguished panelists here who will elaborate the topic and answer the questions like what changes and opportunities there are in the future. What can organizations do? What role do they play in shaping futures and creating better futures for all? And how to use futures in practice. For instance, how to identify changes, how to challenge assumptions, imagine alternative futures and create change. To help answer these questions, we have an excellent panel. Annlise Kjaer, who is a futurist, Kjaer Global Limited, Pasi Vainikka, CEO and co-founder of Solar Foods Limited from Finland, Pupul Pisht, founder, Decolonizing Futures Initiative Project from India, and René Rohrbeck, who is a professor in EDHEC Business School in France. But before we get to the panel discussion, let's start with a question for the audience. And the question is, how do you see the future? There are 4 options to answer. First, I'm excited about all the possibilities. I'm afraid of all the threats. At times I'm afraid, at times I'm excited, and I don't care. I'm living in the present. And the audience has 10 minutes time to answer these questions. We will get back to these answers later in that session. Now let's dive deeper into the topic. To start, we have Annlise Kjaer from Kjaer Global. Kjaer is a renowned futurist and entrepreneur. In 1988, she founded Kjaer Global Limited, a trend management and ideas consultancy, providing organizations with insights to understand the future, drive innovation, and create strategies. Her design background inspires a unique perspective on trends, and she speaks regularly at events such as TEDx, Economist, and the European Union conferences and lectures at Cambridge University, LSE, and MIT. Annlise will be talking about trends, sustainability, and deep futures. Annlise, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, first, huge congratulations to both the technology prize winners. How exciting, how inspiring. And secondly, of course, I'm delighted to be here today to share my vision on deep futures. And just, because there isn't one, but literally many futures that we will see happening in tandem. Now, my big concern, and perhaps many, is that in times of turmoil, our horizons seems to shorten and something takes over. And this is when people find it increasingly hard to see beyond the immediate future, and especially in crises like the current pandemic. And this is what termism is one of our biggest challenges, not just in this decade, but perhaps in this century. And this is radically transforming our relationship with time, because we get sort of an unnatural relation to it. It's almost like a distilling of shock because future ever truly. The long impact of this crisis that we are currently in is very hard to predict, but of course it is possibly forwarding fast forward shifts in behavior and preferences. We see ourselves doing things we wouldn't have done before, and this have of course accelerated many society trends that we are familiar with, while other trends has kind of like taken a backseat. What is certain is that the cultural forces and tectonic shift in technology values, beliefs demands a whole new vision for the future of business, how we engage with communities, society. Now, as a futurist, I like to say, please look back to look forward, because when we look at the evolution of human history, it hasn't just been this nice, even curve of constant progress, but rather a bumpy journey with lots of lessons to be learned. As a futurist, I look back to the past and the present for meaningful signposts of the future. And this 100 years overview shows some of the writing on the wall. I mean, there was obviously, different opinions looking back to look forwards. But if you want to look back, let's say 10 years, maybe look back 20 years, etc., etc. And I think that is what we need in order to understand when did the trend start, because plan can be an opportunity to take timely action. Now, I've always been very inspired by the economist John Maynard Keynes, who did his 100 years forecast back in 1929, where he set up in Cambridge, England. And what he predicted was that by 2030, economic growth would have come to a sort of a plateau, that we would only work 15 hours a week because, as he expressed it, we would have enough to lead the good life. Now, I also believe that in this context, both organizations and cities can help facilitate people's and planet's well-being. And obviously, we just saw in the previous section with Sweden, successfully, the city of Gothenburg tested a 30 hours week, seeing an increase in productivity and performance across all sectors. And this is really interesting that when we are all in this together, we can make a huge difference to the future. Now, I also believe that everything is connected. My 4P innovation model is one that I drafted first time back in 2012 when I was speaking at the Economist conference, the Big Rethink. And what I've seen is that it has evolved over time. But what is certain is that the more things change, the more culture matters. But of course, culture is complex because it's beyond measure. But I always say, just because you can't measure a thing, because you can't see it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. And this is why increasingly whole brain thinking with a purpose just beyond, or a purpose beyond just profit, informs a whole new way of connectedness. And the principles are really simple, because once we balance people and planet and we have a purposeful ethos to match, then of course what we do, we cultivate our ecosystem. We feed into it rather than just feeding off it, and that will lead to sustainable high performance. And let me also add that in this context, of course, multi-stakeholder value is a crucial KPI, key performance indicator. Now, the next slide here I put together a little map, and the idea with my toolkit here is not that for you to read all of the small writing, but more to sort of say that when you to become familiar with how to think, work, and play like a futurist, you're more capable to take timely action, to be a change makers. And in our work, we see when we speak to C-levels of organization that more than ever, perhaps 3 and 4 CEOs will tell you that they now look into foresight as a great way to navigate the future and put long-term goals. And this is really a diagram of trend management in action, because without a map navigating the future, it's like traveling to an unknown destination without your GPS switched on. And really the tools are simple. It's the sort of step-by-step design thinking methodology, because you can't approach the future in a linear fashion. You have to sort of think the sort of, I always use the 8 as the symbol for open thinking, ideation. Then you go into kind of pin down what are the signposts, because that's the only way that you can make sense out of complexity. So the simpler the tools are, the better, because that's how you really can connect the dots in a meaningful way. And this is also how we use those tools to create what we call a trend compass. Now, in this sort of, I would say, risk and opportunity map, we can kind of have an idea of how trends are interconnected. Right now, everyone is looking for inspiration, simply because the pandemic has left many of us with a feeling of uncertainty. So themes like financial security, health and well-being, and family welfare are focal points for most. And these key macro trends already influence us. And many, of course, as I mentioned in my introduction, has been accelerated by COVID-19. But all of them belong in any viable scenario about the future. So when you want to tell stories about the future, and I often say that I'm like a future narrator, I use the trends to understand how to tell meaningful and engaging stories about the future. It's almost like a sell-in. If you can imagine it, you can start to help making it happen. But what, of course, is interesting for societies, communities, organizations, and individuals is to try to explore how those influences might impact tomorrow's world. Where am I on this map? And certainly the smart society foster new alliances and a circular economy to boost performance and positive change for individuals, organizations, and leadership alike. And whatever I work with, I always use my 4P lens of people, planet, purpose, and performance. And in that order, in order to really understand how do we have a meaningful map of the future, a map that is engaging to everyone. But what is also interesting to understand is we're not just speaking about one trend. That interconnectedness of things is perhaps the most important thing. A point that people often seem to miss, that we really have to navigate many different dots, and we have to reconnect them in new ways to see new things. And also trends, they start and they evolve. Now, when you put them into sort of a story map of the future, this 4P outlook indicate the most crucial organizational focus and performance factor driving deep futures and sustainable growth. And of course, values are the new baseline. Now, really, this idea of understanding how every action has a reaction and the interconnectedness of things is a little bit what we heard about in the first session. So whatever you are, an individual, a team leader, a C-level individual, investing in both the rational and the emotional dimension of your organization and operation is crucial for connecting meaningful with people and the communities you serve. And when I speak about the communities, of course, I speak about the ecosystem that we feed into and we feed off, because that's the only way true innovation can happen. And in this context, remember, often seemingly unrelated dots must be connected. And finally, the really key takeaway from my little sort of introduction here to Don't Miss the Future is, number one, be the human interface, because creative leaders are those that empower people through digital inclusion to boost agility. Number two, build social capital, because better together boosts community, while lifelong learning, of course, as we heard earlier, foster innovation capacity. And when you look at the softer, more, I would say, emotional touch points, show that you care, because when people know you care, they care too. And in fact, caring organizations embed inclusion in their business model to engage with all stakeholders. And finally, invite deep dialogue, because people trust organizations who support their values. That's integrity, which again foster resilience and that feeling of being connected to something that's bigger than yourself. And finally, I sincerely believe that the future is just not somewhere we go. We create the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annlise. That was a great beginning of our event. Thank you very much. It sounds always very good and encouraging when the futurist is highlighting, for instance, among other things, the circular economy. Because I also believe that circular economy is one of the major change maker, both in our societies, but also in the economy. So let's now turn to our panel. I'd like to ask our panelists to give quick reactions and comments on what Annlise said. Pasi, you are sitting next to me. What resonated the most in Annalise's presentation?
Yeah, I agree. With the 4 Ps, we as a startup, being maybe the most agile form of a company and business, we really feel that in our gut and bones, because the startup is about people. Venture capital goes to people, not to the technology, but the people who make it happen. And also, it needs to be sustainable, planet in a broader manner. Also, what we see is that in our recruitment, that people, this also may be a generation issue, are looking for not for profit and money, but purpose for life. And if the company can provide a purpose, then it resonates with more and more people, and then the whole company piling these together will succeed.
Well, Annlise, it sounds like you got the verification from the entrepreneur who is in future business, providing solutions. So it's a good start. Who else? Who wants to continue? Rene.
Yeah, I can come in. It's for me. I'm also a futurist at heart, but I'm also a strategist in business. So I teach strategy. I'm also working with companies on strategy. And what the most challenging often is simply time to have attention on thinking about purpose, time to go into this mental time travel. And I think for all of us, this is actually both a challenge, but also when I heard about this 30-hour work week, I don't know how many in the audience, how many here in the virtual room or in the studio are working 30 hours. But I think for all of us, this ability to slow down at times and put attention on purpose, put the attention on mid and long-term developments we want to have is crucial. And this is something which we're fighting a lot for in our daily life. But that's something we all need to win.
Indeed. Before I give the floor to Pupul, I forgot to mention earlier that the audience can also pose questions online. But Pupul.
Yeah, I think that was a really, and Lisa touched on some really critical points on things that we often forget to think about, or especially when, when we're doing business, or even when we're in innovation processes or decision-making processes. I think one of the key things that struck me from her presentation was the way she began by talking about deep time and long time. And I'm a bit of a self-professed time nerd, so I have personal interest in that. But I genuinely feel, in my practice, I think that is the first and foremost challenge or barrier for people to be able to think about the future and care for it, is that we are very, very limited, especially in the modern capitalistic society that we live in. We're extremely limited to think about and care for a time that's beyond our lifetimes. So my background's in design, and as a young designer, I've always taken a lot of care to quite intentionally think about anything that I conceptualize on my sketch pad and that I design is going to go out and live in the world. And it's not enough for us to just think about that moment or that year or the 10 years of that. Anything that you put out in the world is going to shape the lives of people and have intended and unintended consequences on their lives and even the way the planet is for generations to come. So I think in anything that we do, whether it's with design, with innovation or business, it's really important to think about that long time that Annlise spoke about, and think about, what is the kind of legacy that we're actually leaving behind in the world, and is it aligned to the values that we say we hold as individuals or businesses? And oftentimes, when we think about the long term, we'll find that we say we have certain values, but the kind of things, the kind of ripple effects that we're setting out in the world actually don't do justice to those values. So I think thinking in long term, thinking beyond individual lifetimes is extremely important in doing this work.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much. So now we move forward, but before we get to the next speaker, let's look at the results of the first audience questions. And it looks like the majority of the audience belongs to the future positive camp. So 56% of those who answered says that at time I'm afraid, at time I'm excited. So it's quite balanced, I would say. And the second biggest group belongs to the camp which says that I'm excited about all the possibilities. Good. So the next speaker is Mr. Pasi Vainikka from Solar Foods, and he will talk about surprisingly sustainable future. Vainikka is Chief Executive Officer at Solar Foods Limited that he co-founded in 2017. Before this, he led a strategic initiative, Neocarbon Energy. That was the single largest renewable energy research in Finland so far. Spin-off projects from that initiative include Solitaire pilot plant producing fuel from air, Neocarbon food concept for producing healthy protein from air, now commercialized by Solar Food, as well as the world's first simulation for global 100% renewable electricity system named the Internet of Energy. So Pasi, Solar Food says it produces food out of thin air. It sounds pretty exciting. How do you do that and how does it work? Looking forward to your presentation. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm encouraged this morning to stand up and speak for the future's jobs and industries. It's quite important because the ever faster and faster development of technologies makes it possible, or they enable exponential, unlinear, surprising, and these days surprisingly sustainable solutions. And during this talk, I want to give two examples, one from the past and one, if you like, from the future. What does this mean? I see that we are separated from the future by a wall that I call future wall. New technologies create openings to this wall. And it's not only an opening, this new technology, but it's an opening through which you can see future developments where complementing technologies building on each other, create unlinear, surprising, and exponential developments. One example, of course, is the, let's say, broadly speaking, Moore's law, which literally means the doubling of the number of transistors every 2 years on a silicon chip. But broadly speaking, you could interpret as a whole to represent the development of information communication technologies, let's say since the 1980s. So if you imagine you would be Bill Gates building the first personal computers in a garage early 1980s, so computers that are big, ugly, expensive, and unpowerful, it would have been too far-fetched to pitch those days to say that, look, soon these computers will be interconnected with a thing called the internet. And not only that, it will be wireless. Not only that, all these computers that are big now, they will be handheld after a couple of decades. Each of these computers will be as powerful as the supercomputers of the 1980s. And not only that, after a couple of decades, the most powerful and big companies on the planet will develop so-called apps to these mobile phones. And some of these apps are social media apps that will actually have significant societal impacts. This would have been too far-fetched, I claim, in the 1980s. So from Moore's law now transitioning to food tech, where Solar Foods and I come from. Instead of Moore's law, we can see there is so-called thing, Moore's law. It means we are now entering a phase in a similar situation where the information communication technology was in the 1980s in food technology for disconnecting food production from agriculture. You need to remember about 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are due to what we eat and not because of the energy. We need to fundamentally more efficient food system. What we are doing at Solar Foods is basically we are making food out of thin air, this kind of single-cell protein powder that we produce using electricity and carbon dioxide. And this is an example of development, surprising development perhaps, regarding complementing technologies. Because we use electricity instead of sunlight to grow these organisms that nutritionally are somewhere a hybrid of meat, carrot and soybean, we are enjoying the fast development and price decline in solar and wind power, which is not due to us, but we need this cheap electricity. These technologies were laughed at only a couple of years ago. We use direct air capture of CO2, which is a developing technology to harvest our CO2, and then using this new biology to grow the organism. And these products can be, for example, my grandchildren can have meat as of today, but these meat alternatives and cultured meat factories that brew the meat of the future will not eat the feed as cows do today, but we are developing a feed for the cultured meat factories. So at the end, consumer will have meat as of today, but how it arrived on the plate had nothing to do with agriculture as we understand it today. We need 1/10 of the land compared to photosynthetic plants. If we free this land, current agricultural land, and let forests grow back, then effectively the gift to the society is a carbon negative technology. Our focus is on empowering the individual. Of course, there has to be a proper policy in place, but we need to, as a startup, to empower the individual to make good choices and be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And the scientist and the former scientist's role is basically to show that science is like magic but real. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Pasi. Everybody knows the Moore's law. We all know also coleslaw, which is served in pub lunches together with hamburgers. But now we should supposed to understand Moore's law. Any reactions from the other panelists who want to start? Annlise.
Yeah, just congratulations. It was a great presentation, and thank you for introducing me to Moore's law. Now I know a new trend. I think that many new innovations are very much about that we are very uncomfortable with something we haven't really tried and tested on our own body. it's like global warming. We don't really imagine it's real because it's happening so far away. But a good example of moving from milk, dairy products, milk from cows, now oat milk, which has been, Oatly, I shared the floor with one of the marketeers from there. It's interesting to see how that's just become common. Everybody has oat milk or some other milk alternatives in their house. And I definitely see there's a lot of hope in this innovation, and how inspiring, especially I speak from the designer at heart, to see great innovation happens where creativity meets, I would say, science. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. René, in your experience, how well do companies take advantage of surprises or radical technologies?
Yeah, it's a difficult relationship. Large established companies and the new. All of the large companies want it. All of them struggle. One of the things which you need to be able to do is do this mental time travel, which Pasi for us created in this session, that you are able to see a new situation where you will be using much less land, for instance, to bring food to people. This is something which is appealing. There's other things which the Frenchman will be wondering about, whether his steak is still the same steak he had before. Pasi also gave us some insights about that. I think many companies struggle in particular to do the mental time travel as a group. And that is crucial if you're in large organizations where you have larger executive boards, you have maybe even supervisory boards, which would have a say about very strategic investments. And for us, the goal is to supply also the methods and tools to do that. So I'm sure I could have a fantastic conversation with Pasi talking about how do you create this type of discussion within the organization, but also towards then the supply chain and the rest of the industry in order to prepare them also to adopt then such an innovation.
Thank you. Pasi was talking about empowering individuals to do the change. I guess this resonates with you too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as I was listening to his incredible presentation, every part of it was so fascinating, but I couldn't help but think, how do we then engage our farming communities, around the world in an innovation like this? What does that participation look like? And not just invite them in, but, what are ways in which we can leverage and engage with existing, generational knowledge in those communities. And I would imagine that being a big piece in this innovation, getting traction. And I think it also obviously will be very, very different, because the way our food systems are designed and the infrastructure is varies a lot from country to country and continent to continent. But I'd be quite fascinated to see what that journey looks like.
Before you comment, Pasi, on that, there is one question from the audience. Somebody said that, Pasi, you said people are not looking for money but for a purpose. But startups and venture capitalists, the most visible engines of tech growth, are not known for being led by culture, traditionally led by growth alone. That culture may be changing, but is it changing as fast, as widely as it is among the wider public? What do you think?
Financing startup must not be an honorable way to get poor. So there must be a growth opportunity for sure. But again, I return to the 4 Ps. It's not either or anymore. You need to have all of them. And I a bit disagree. One of the greatest conflicts actually in the innovation system, also including Finland here, is that institutions, academia offer technologies, but venture capitalists fund the team. Team is everything, and the money goes to the team, and the venture capitalists look that these people have the highest probability to succeed when they will experience problem. So culture is in the very, very core of it instead.
Okay, good. So we come back to people, planet, purpose, profit way of thinking.
Yeah.
You wanted to comment on any panelists?
Yeah, I guess the time travel is human brain. Maybe it's inherently good that the human memory is poor. If it would be great, we would be carrying all the burden of the history and you couldn't renew and you would lose all the energy. But then again, trying to see future needs some kind of time traveling. It might be that I cannot be completely objective here because I'm an engineer by training, but thinking in an objective way that let's say battery, if you would have this and that kind of battery, then what would happen? And my key claim with the wall is that the first argument is not to discuss what happens if there's a great battery to empower, let's say, electric vehicles. That were also laughed at only a couple of years ago. But now it's new reality. The debate is not on the consequences, but it's a debate if there is a window, if there is this technology or not. And this is typically, you could say, that big industry kills new ideas, because if the disruption happens, then somebody needs to renew.
Exactly. So thank you. Now it's time for a second audience question. How do you see futurist thinking in your work? And there are three options. We continuously analyze trends and weak signals and use them to guide our strategy and actions. Second, we think of desirable societal futures and make an effort to recognize our biases about the future. And third, we don't have time or resources for future thinking. And again, 10 minutes time to answer, and we'll get back to this question later on this session. Now we move forward, and it's time to focus on who is included when thinking about futures and why broadening the range of voices heard is so crucial. Bubul Bisht will lead us deeper into this topic. Bisht is the founder of the Decolonizing Futures initiative. Futurist and multidisciplinary designer, she uses narrative tools as a foresight method. Through her initiative, Bisht is pioneering the use of her novel foresight method inspired by the Kavad folk storytelling tradition of Rajasthan, India, to engage historically marginalized communities in envisioning their preferred futures. Bubul, we have been talking about different possible futures, and you work with helping people envision preferred futures. Who would you say owns or shapes images of the future? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Erkki, for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and we're having a great conversation. And I think you ask a really important question at the right time, because we've been talking about the importance of long-term thinking, but also, how to really perceive and sense change in our current environment, and how those signals, sometimes very, very weak, can become indications of emerging futures. But I think it is also important for us to, as we're having this discussion, really pause and ask, but actually, where are these images of what we think the future is going to look like actually come from? Why do we think the future will look a certain way versus another way? Where we all come in with certain conscious and subconscious assumptions about this time that is yet to come. And my practice has been really, really rooted in sort of examining where those assumptions and biases actually come from. So, as I was studying foresight, and I formerly studied foresight, and now I practice as a futurist, I just want to pull up this diagram, which anyone who is familiar with future studies or foresight would have seen before. It's called the Futures Cone. And it's really one of the most fundamental frameworks in futures work. But I truly believe, and this has been my experience in my practice, is that even though as practitioners we are committed to talking about futures, always in the plural, futures, and never the future, because we always want to keep that space open for multiple possibilities, if we actually really examine the images of the futures that we collectively build or hold below the surface, we'll realize that somehow subconsciously we're actually building quite singular images of the future. So how do we do that? We do that because we're constantly reproducing dominant ideas, value systems. And when we do that, systems, ideas and voices that have been historically dominant are still, the ones that are guiding our imagination of the future. And when we do that, what we're really doing, intentionally or unintentionally, is we're perpetuating the marginalization of anybody and anything that does not fit that very narrow image. So even though we talk about many possible futures all the time, we really need to ask, are these many futures really that plural and diverse? And unfortunately, most often than not, they're not. So I'm quite fascinated by what the pop cultural imagination of the future is. And if you actually go and do a quick internet image search, these are the kind of monochromatic sci-fi kind of mood boards that you will find. And actually this is not very far from, if you ask a lay person to close their eyes and imagine what the future is going to look like, they are going to imagine something like this. And it's quite fascinating why we think the future looks like that. Why is that the image of a city of the future? Where are all the people? We talk about being human-centered, but actually our images of the future tend to be so devoid of humanity, and forget about other species that we actually share this planet with and need to be thinking about. And sometimes if you add more qualifying adjectives like sustainable futures, it just minorly shifts to a green palette versus a blue palette. But I think that what we really need in doing meaningful futures work, if we're truly committed to imagine a future for all, we need to accept that these futures cannot continue to be imagined by a few, which is what the traditional practice in the field has been like. And I truly think that we need to change the story that we tell ourselves at a collective, at a global scale, about what the future is going to be like. And so, in the audience, people who are listening, they might wonder, so in my work as an individual or as a business owner, as a decision maker, what do you mean we need to change the story about the future? How can we actually start telling more diverse stories about the future? And I think it's actually quite simple. It's not that complicated, because if you really think about it, all stories about the future really have a simple question at their core, which is a what if question, right? So if we want to tell more diverse and plural narratives about this future, we need to really put a lot of effort and intention into making sure that we're asking that what if question from many different vantage points and many different perspectives. And I did that in my practice. For me, it's really important in doing that to actually be decolonizing the future, because, like I said, I think dominant hegemonic ideas really colonize our imagination of the future. And for far too long, non-Western cultures, non-Western ways of knowing, being, and doing have not been the ones that have shaped that collective image of the future that we hold globally. And it's time to start making room for that. And I do that through my project called the Decolonizing Futures Initiative. And like you said in my introduction, being a designer, I have a huge methodological bias myself. So I really feel that if we want to change the outcome, it's important to change the process. So when we say we want to decolonize the imagination of the future, we need to also decolonize our toolkit, the methods that we actually use to envision those futures. For me, my inspiration came from, in designing this new method, my inspiration came from a really ancient folk storytelling tradition in India called Kawar. And what fascinated me about this practice is that actually 400 years ago, when this story tradition emerged, it emerged as an act of facilitating social inclusion. So these storytellers were nomadic, and they would travel to communities that were not allowed access to, religious places of worship because they belonged to marginalized castes. So they used story as a tool to create that social inclusion, and, stories as a tool for change making. And I found that really fascinating. So the framework for my methodological innovation takes inspiration from that, and I adapted the 10 steps of pilgrimage from the Kawar storytelling tradition as the 10 steps of time travel. So in my workshops, I work with communities, and really build constructive, innovative, and inclusive stories and narratives about the future that are really emerging bottom up, that are owned by the communities who are themselves going to be, stakeholders and ancestors of the futures that are being imagined. And I think in doing this work, what I have realized is it was quite fascinating for me is that when I asked these people, whether I was working with middle school children in India whose parents work, as manual scavengers and waste pickers, or I was working with a team of women from rural Ghana who were learning solar engineering in India, actually, to transform their villages. Every time I ask them, what is it that you envision for your future and for the future of your community or your country? Sadly, the reaction that I was met with almost every single time is that they were shocked that I was asking them that question, because they didn't think that it mattered what they think about the future. They are so used to, or most of us are so used to, our futures being imagined somewhere else by someone else, and really being handed down to us. And through my presentation and through this work, really, I just hope to create space for communities and people and cultures that have been historically left out of this conversation to really start seeing themselves as active shapers of their own futures, rather than, passive recipients of someone else's spectacular vision that might be really exciting and great, but actually does not reflect the needs and desires and realities of people who are actually going to be living those futures. So I think that's really important. And through my work, I've learned that positive stories are really powerful change-making tools. And it's not about building unrealistic utopias that promise happy endings and ignore the crises that we face in our world, but really about constructively being able to imagine a way out of, the despair of our present times. If, like Annlise said, if we can't imagine it, we cannot create it. So we have to invest time and effort in doing that. And as important as it is to envision new positive stories, I think it's also important to critically examine the current stories that we tell ourselves about the future. And whatever it is, that if a narrative doesn't serve us anymore, we need to be able to let go of it. So as I wrap up my presentation, I just want you to leave with one last question that I think is a really useful way of critically examining currently held biases and assumptions and narratives about the future. It's like, anytime you envision a future in a certain manner, ask yourself, by imagining the future in that way, who or what is being rendered invisible through that narrative, what is being left out, and how can we consciously build pathways to bring those left out perspectives and voices back into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pupul. Decolonizing the future and democratization of foresight are very important topics, which also, and everything you said resonates very well with me. I'm coming from Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, which is a Think, Do and Connect tank. And one of our main task is to do foresight, but at the same time popularize foresight. Because we believe that the more there are people who understand the possibilities of different futures, the more there are capabilities to assess how things are going, and it's very important from the societal resilience point of view too. So foresight should not be only a privilege of rare. Instead, it should provide new imagination and thus make our societies more resilient. But now I turn back to our panel. Who wants to start commenting? Rene.
I could jump in. I was fascinated by the talk, also by this very thought-provoking final question. What are we missing in the narratives about the future? I think when I'm teaching in MBA classes, I typically ask my students to just imagine a situation where they want to imagine new futures for their family. And this is something where we might be actually then the colonizing person. Right? We often don't start to think about what our children would like. You might think about some frustration you have and how to change those. You could say, I'm in my corporate job and there's so many constraints. Wouldn't it be great to become a diving instructor in some nice place? A future actually which my first boss took. I still remember this, that after the first week of working in a new company, he said, well, by the way, I'm soon not going to be your boss anymore because I'm going to become a diving instructor and move with my family to Egypt. And that was a corporate job, so that was quite an interesting future to take. But this notion of how do we bring in this dialogue of saying there is a future in the corporate world, there is a future becoming an entrepreneur, there is maybe a future becoming a sports coach, and all of this would actually change not just my future, but the future of my family, the future of people around me. And I need to bring them into this dialogue to make it really meaningful. Because only then will we also co-construct this situation we want to have, co-own it, and find purpose in change. And this is something which everyone can ask oneself, how often have I actively been doing that? And it doesn't need to be life-changing. You can also ask yourself, have I been doing this to discuss about the next holiday? Or is there just one family member having an idea where the next travel should go and how great it would be? So this idea of co-constructing the future, whether it's small or big, is something which is fascinating.
Thank you. Annlise.
Thank you very much, Pupul. That was so inspiring. And I really see myself as a future narrator, because we as futurists must, in a way, kind of kindle the sort of oral tradition of telling good stories about the future. I normally engage in a preferred future, but also plausible future, or I would say like the sort of really small is beautiful, big is beautiful. This idea of telling stories in different contexts that makes us also relate to things outside our own ego. And I think as well, stepping out of our comfort zone to do that. Women are really good at that. And it's really nice to see how many women were engaged in your storytelling classes. And this idea that you, with a simple toolkit, Pupul, can inspire them to actually understand that they can be active change makers of the future. Because really, many people don't believe that they are the CEOs of their own life. They're kind of put into a system and then they just press repeat and they live this hamster wheel lives where they think they have no control. and we do more than we think so, and especially when we get together and we collaborate, as Renée says, that we co-create the future. But every time we are put in the situation, we think we have to explain everything. And we spend so much time in explaining and trying to make variable business cases for things that in the end feels right, they're common sense. And this is really why we need whole brain thinking. We need to understand that the more diverse the group of the thinkers are, the people that are contributing, from engineers to design thinkers to scientists to, you name them, all of them, the policymakers, we all need to sit around the table and try to understand the different point of view. And I like this idea that Ray Dalio, who's a fund investor, he speaks about thoughtful disagreement. It's not about agreeing, it's about really asking better questions about the future. And I would like to say that curiosity and creativity are superpowers in this conversation. We don't really mention them because it's again something you can't measure. But curiosity is a superpower because it's key to critical thinking. If you ask scientists how they came up with an innovation on idea, they know that it's by logic we prove, but it's with intuition we discover. So why don't we just start to make that common sense, teach it, the schools, engage the young people, and again, people that you are, working with young people to create the future, they see as the better future. That makes them get that sense of that we too can be part of something bigger than ourselves. And this is also back to Pasi, who says that, it's about making people imagine the future together. And I guess that it's very much about just understanding that the 4 Ps are really, when we can balance them, what's good for people and planet, and when it's meaningful, purposeful, of course, then we all benefit from that in the end.
Exactly. Pasi.
Yes, in Bobo's talk, I was, of course, intrigued halfway of the what-if question. I guess that's the typical breakfast what we all should have to kind of intrigue our imagination. However, I can see here one theme that is repeating, which is who. Who shapes the future? You can also, in the futures research, I believe it's called actor analysis. I keep on coming to the same topic. Okay, in Solar Foods now developing the future of food, and yet we know that the self-expression, individualism, again through social media, is so powerful. And we are thinking all the time that is there an interplay? How does future food promote self-expression? If you are in conflict of this trend, maybe you will not succeed. So the individualism, I call it empowering the individual, is the key. So and that also has to do with the trend of globalization, that all the people through the mobile devices have all the information on the planet for free, real time. So if you can empower individual through that, then things start to move regardless of maybe legislation. And those trajectories you might want to keep a close track on.
Exactly. Pupul, you want to comment on that?
No, I think that's exactly it, and I think that there's also an opportunity to, in thinking about who shapes the future, it's also about who should shape the future, and if we're really committed to building inclusive futures, then the power to shape the future has to lie with people who are going to live in those futures. So I would encourage us, I would just say that, it's important to just think a little beyond the experts. And really, we need to respect that people are also, they bring a kind of expertise that the top-down experts cannot, who are removed from those contexts and those realities can never bring. And there's definitely an opportunity here to really get participatory and, leverage our collective intelligence, whether that's of citizens or whether that's of smaller communities in envisioning and building these futures.
Exactly. Good. Before we go to the final speaker, or actually it's going to be more like an interview, we look at the results of the second audience question. How do you use futures thinking in your work? 45% of respondents says we continuously analyze trends and weak signals and use them to guide our strategy and actions. It sounds quite promising. And the second group is that we think of desirable society futures and make an effort to recognize our biases about the future. Good. So the next panelist is René Rohrbeck, who is a professor of strategy and director of the chair for foresight, innovation and transformation at the EDHEC Business School in France. And he's also a partner in the Rohrbeck Hager Consultancy. He is known for his groundbreaking work in corporate foresight. René, for sake of breaking the way we have run the panel so far, is it okay for you if I pose some questions to you and kind of interview? Excellent.
Absolutely.
Good. So, René, you are best known for your pioneering work on future preparedness of organizations. And you also work with leading organizations to develop new methods and tools to help them manage in a turbulent world. I think I read first article of yours some 15 years ago when you were still working at Deutsche Telekom. It was about the introduction of a strategic trend radar. So why was that needed? Was the telecommunication industry at that time not a nice cash cow?
Yes, you're of course right. It's one of the most beautiful business models. You get taxpayers' money to dig up the ground and lay cables, and then you tax people for sending information over those cables. So essentially being a telecommunication operator is wonderful. You have a stable business model, except if regulation comes in and except if technology will disrupt that business model. And at that time, it was already clear that things like what we call in the telecommunication jargon, the upward profit migration will happen, where so if the money will be not earned by the one owning the network, but the one running interesting services, apps, etc. on a network. So in that sense, it was also a textbook case of having to deal with disruptive change by not trying to protect what you have, but by venturing out and trying new things and trying new businesses. And that was very much what we were aiming to do.
Yeah, and now you are in academia, and in the research side you have changed the side of the table. So still interested in foresight. Wouldn't it be more meaningful to stay in business, or do you think that you can achieve more change by being in research side?
Well, I have indeed the luxury to be able to do a bit of both. So my passion has started probably at a point when I was frustrated in large organizations to actually observe what is called in academia the incumbent's curse. So this idea that as an incumbent, you have this history, which Pasi was talking about, and because of that history, you push this repeat button, which Annlise was evoking. And this is something you see, this is something which is also there in a sense for good reasons, because the system also needs to protect itself, and it does. But whenever something new comes in, it's very hard to be then not killed early on. And this is something which created the passion of really understanding from a psychological point of view what is happening here, and also from a business process and practice point of view what is happening here and how can we improve our future orientation and then also our future preparedness, or what I like to call now future fitness, for which I then build model to measure this also.
Yeah, excellent. In your benchmarking work, you identified companies that vigilant companies that clearly outcompete their peers in firm performance. So tell us, what is it that these companies can, which others cannot? Vigilant companies.
Mm-hmm. So I like to link that actually to 4 capabilities, which you can also observe in another context. So I like to say companies which are vigilant, which are regularly able to go to new shores, they're a bit like surfers. They need to be able to understand what kind of waves of change are going to break their industry. And today there's some big waves like digitalization, climate change, and you need to understand the mechanics underneath it. So climate change as such is not changing anything for companies, and particularly not huge investments which you want to tap into. But today in the good old European way, we're starting to talk nicely in back offices about the ESG criteria, about taxonomy, what does it mean to be green? And then eventually the Pandora box opens and there's a whole set of new rules which can be applied by investors to invest in more green companies. And this is sort of the type of waves which you need to anticipate, like a surfer anticipates that by looking into the weather forecast. And then you need to understand what does it mean to be then successful on that wave. And many organizations today have completely overlooked the war for talent, for digital talent, the ability to link visionary competence to digital competence. And now they really struggle to find people to be able to work in that space. And then I think what for large organizations is hardest potentially is like a surfer to find the right moment to now start paddling, to now get onto the wave before somebody else does, and to profit from it all the way to the shore. Knowing, however, that eventually once you hit the shore, you also need to paddle out again and find a new business, a new pocket of value, which you can work with as an organization. And this is really what sticks out when we look at deep case studies over a longer period of time, and also what we were able to find when we were doing our benchmark studies over longer periods of time, in this case 7 years for instance, where we looked what happened to firms which are future prepared.
Yeah, interesting points. You mentioned Pandora box, which is open now, and there are plenty of new regulations coming to the market, but also new challenges. So the market economy and the industrial operations cannot continue in business as usual basis, because, for instance, biodiversity loss, circular economy, climate change, just to mention a few examples, are challenging the business models. And there are people who says that we're supposed to move towards post-GDP growth world. I don't share this view myself, but we have to define what is better growth. What are the values we should give to market? Because market economy doesn't have any values, it only has features. So people must give values to market and let it function efficiently to produce whatever we want it to produce. So that's very much, that's very good. So more generally speaking, do you think that organization place enough attention on the future? And do your studies give indications of how much time top management teams place on the future?
Yeah, so I was invoking this attention already from the beginning. It's also a question which, if I'm sitting in the audience, I can also ask about myself. How often do I pause in my daily life and think about what will be my future in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, etc.? This is a very interesting question on a personal level. And of course, it's also very relevant on an organizational level. And I was inspired by some work from Gary Hamel and C.K. Prahlad, which published a book in 1994 about what they call competing for the future. And the way they defined it was organizations make a conscious effort to look beyond their current business into the future more than 5 years, and with a team, which could be the management team or another team in the organization. And they said, well, this is no more than 3% on average in organizations. So while, if I'm asking my son what a CEO would be doing, then he is probably thinking that CEO is thinking 90% of their time about the future and how to make the organization successful. And in our research, we indeed find that these 3% might be even too optimistic. In most cases, the pressure on taking decisions about a number of issues on a daily basis has only increased over the last couple of decades. I still remember my first boss, who was the CIO from Deutsche Telekom, who said, well, some 7 years ago when I started this job, I was receiving a letter from the CEO asking me all kinds of questions. And then I had 3 months to answer to this letter so that he then could take decisions based on the data I provided. And you know what? Now it's 10 o'clock. I already received 3 emails and 2 SMS from that same CEO. And we're living in a time where fighting for this attention for slow thinking becomes increasingly hard. And however, that doesn't mean that we should then bend to this pressure, but we should rather make sure that we have the processes in place to do that. And this is what we try to also help by giving with our future fitness model firms a reflection point of saying there's actually something more we need to do.
Yeah, interesting. Now I'd like to open the floor for the other panelists.
May I comment first?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, very interesting points, and I was writing down many things. Something that I'm maybe encouraged to recommend, and something what I've seen has changed meanwhile during my 20 years of career, is that in the past, the big corporates used to have big R&D departments. And there's the risk that this department is a bubble. They live in a bubble. And to avoid that bubble, what I see more and more is that first they were running down these operations, which was unfortunate. There was nothing really to replacing that. But now, to maybe great surprise, but also being happy about it, there is a thing called corporate venturing. So you're investing to startups, which are excellent vehicles for business intelligence. What is there? What is happening? Because I'm bold to say that the startup is the most efficient vehicle taking something forward towards the market. And this might help big companies in what you brought up earlier, timing and how do you anticipate and how to be successful, because this startup will have to have a business model as well.
Exactly. Who wants to continue? Pupul.
Yeah. There were 2 things that I want to talk about that really struck me. One is the incumbent's curse, which I have encountered a lot in my work. The past 1 year I've been, working as a network weaver and creative lead at School of International Futures. And we're building this next generation foresight practice, and really we've been nurturing and weaving this network of over 300 change makers, young change makers, emerging change makers from 69 countries around the world. And I truly believe in doing this work that what we're lacking right now in the business space, but also in the governance and policy making space, is that there isn't enough opportunity and avenues for an intergenerational dialogue. We really need to make more spaces and build more processes that enable incumbents to be in dialogue or to be in a knowledge sharing mode with really the next generation. And like I was saying, it is the emerging generations that are going to be living a lot of the futures that are being imagined right now. And therefore, it is important for them to be, the ones setting the agenda for those futures as well. So I think, and it's quite inspiring. A lot of the countries, Wales has the Future Generations Bill now, and a lot of the countries are beginning to take this more seriously. And how do we actually really recognize future generations or younger generations as key stakeholders in, decision making about the future? And that's definitely something that is going to become more and more important as we move forward. So that was one thing that really struck me. But then the other thing that Renee said towards the end, which I think was, he said it so simply, but it's such a powerful statement. I think making room for slow work. And there's definitely a lack of recognition and respect for slow work, especially in today's time. And I think it's also a product of our always on culture, modern communications technologies that make us feel like everything is urgent. But it instantly made me think about a really beautiful yet simple framework that was actually developed by Stuart Brand of the Long Now Foundation, and it's called the Pace Layers Diagram. And it's a really great way of, thinking at, systemically about the future. And it has these layers that are stacked over each other. So the topmost or the outermost layer is of fashion and economy, and then there's commerce under that, then infrastructure, then governance, then culture, and at the very last is nature. And what that diagram really does is it surfaces the importance of recognizing and respecting the pace of change at each of these layers. And what happens is right now, when we're thinking about the future, when we're thinking about innovation, all of that happens on the topmost layer of fashion and technology, where the pace of change is less than 5 years. But oftentimes by intervening at that layer, we by default expect that change is going to be triggered almost instantaneously at, say, the cultural level or governance level. But that is not possible because the pace of change at those layers is much longer, right? So governance is probably decades, but culture runs in centuries. And then when you talk about nature, when we talk about a planetary scale, change really happens at the scale of millennia, right? And so bringing that awareness of how change actually slows down and speeds up, depending on where we're making that intervention, is also, I think, really, really key in doing this work.
Yeah, interesting. Annlise.
I believe that what you said earlier, that the more people who think about the future, the better it is for our common future. And I also really agree with people, long-term is crucial to a better world happening. And Renee, we are all stuck in that kind of time bubble. We can't sort of seem to get out of it. But I guess that the pandemic has been in some way, if there was a positive takeaway, is that it gives us time, for some of us at least, to stop up and prioritize time to think for what do I really, really want for my future. And time to think is crucial to asking better questions about the future. It's not just about finding all the answers. What if your questions weren't the right ones? Not that I'm proposing that there are just a specific set of questions, but really asking better questions about the future, the critical thinking, the activity, and this idea when you ask, for example, people were saying technology seems to be what sets the trends in many ways. The CEO of Dell, one of our clients, Michael Dell, was asked in an interview, so what do you think, Michael, will be the most important leadership skill in the future? And he said, I will put my bet on curiosity. And I think that's really touching. But when we look at both Pupul and René mentioned some literature and references of people who were inspiring. I mean, I was born in the 60s, but the 70s was really my period of waking up. And I think we have a global wake up. But what I've taken away from the 1970s are two very interesting happenings. In fact, three, because in 1970, obviously Alvin Toffler, he wrote the book in collaboration with his wife called Future Shock. And isn't it interesting to see that many of the references that we have today, 50 years later, are from that book? Another one is the E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. And there's so much truth and knowledge in that. And he particular speaks about sustainability and how we together can create a much more, I would say, meaningful approach to the future. And of course, the third thing is that in the 1970s, Shell were, instigating with Pierre Wack heading the team of futurists to come up with scenarios for the future. Of course, what is a bit unfortunate with the Shell scenarios is that they seldom include people. That's starting to change because of the collaborations they have. And I would like to just leave all of us with a sort of interesting quote that actually E.F. Schumacher wrote from his book. He said that any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, more violent, but it takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the exact opposite direction.
Thank you very much, Annlise. A very interesting quote. So we are coming to the end of our session, but the last round of very quick comments, like 30 seconds, on question, what inspires the most in the future? What is the thing which inspires you the most in the future? Just to give you 30 seconds time to think, I could start myself. I really want to be part of the systemic change where we decouple GDP growth from biodiversity loss. And other way around, that how we can connect market economy to produce more biodiversity. And the second is, I would like to be part of the change where we create fair rules for growing data economy. So that people can use more data, but they also trust those who use our data. Pasi.
I try to make myself free of burdens of the past, but also of the future by thinking that I'm not to be a pessimist, not an optimist, but a possibilist. So all the opportunities are there and you go with the flow.
Thank you. Pupul.
What inspires? That's such a great question. I think I am really inspired by people, and I find it extremely inspiring when people really embrace their collective power in questioning the status quo and really imagining something that is quite different from what we've experienced but should be imagined.
Good. René.
Well, I was just thinking about a joke which was told to me once, and that goes so that there's two planets which meet, and one says, well, you're looking so sad, what's wrong? And then the planet says, well, I have Homo sapiens. And then the other one says, well, don't worry, that will go away. And that's how many futurists think, in a sense. It's saying, we all this unresponsible lot who kill our own planet and make all things bad. And I like to take the opposite stance and say, no, we have human agency. We can change things. And I'm seeing happening it all around. And I like also the reference to the younger generation. It's amazing to have seen these Fridays for the Future, but also this more broader, younger people getting up saying, I don't want to run a company like my parents did or like my grandparents did. We need to have different values. We need to bring in circularity, etc. So I'm very hopeful about the future because I do believe in this human agency to do the right thing. And I'm seeing a lot of empirical evidence that this is already happening.
Thank you. Annlise.
Thank you. I'm so inspired that, I'm actually now in business since 32 years, so I'm in my 4th decade. And the last part of my life, I'm approaching 60 next year, I've actually been very privileged to work, around my purpose throughout my life. But it's obviously only when you get to sort of this age that you realize that my purpose have always been to inspire people. Sometimes I've worked against it. So the opportunity for me, and as people, I love people to go out and teach people how to be self-empowered and take control and start creating the world they want to live in. And also, in a way, being part of that greater purpose, but also finding their role inside that. And I think that telling stories about the future is such a great purpose, and to be able even to be here and discuss with all of you great minds and see that you're actually doing the same. You're inspiring people to take charge over the future. So for me, that's just so inspiring, because then I know there's hope for all of us.
Excellent. It's always good to stop with the word hope. So what is inspiring discussion. Thank you very much, our panelists. You have shared your fresh thinking, and it has been so inspiring to get your ideas to the wider perspective. I also want to thank audience for participating in this, and this session is over now. Thank you very much, and I wish a good continuation of the event. Over to you.
Jyrki, thank you very much. Thank you all of you for joining. Some powerful views there, some strategies even for dealing with the future. Right now, though, we need to turn to the Future Bazaar, fittingly enough, and we have just a tiny bit of time. Very unusually, we're running a little bit early. Something about thinking about the future, I guess. So we have a small amount of time to visit the partner organizations in their virtual booths. Again, partners in Brella, and you can catch the virtual visits that you might have missed last time. So the consecutive 15-minute slots are Metsä Group or Vaisala at 12:45, Neste Corporation or Halton Group at 1 o'clock, and Aalto University or Nokia Corporation at 1:15. Do explore, go visiting. It's all under the schedule there at left in Brella. And don't forget to follow at Millennium Prize on Twitter, where everything is being live tweeted. Share your own thoughts. Take a silly photo. Share it. We will see you back here on the main stage stream there on the left in, just about an hour at 1:45 Finland time. Thank you very much.